Your Excellency, firstly, thank you for that fantastic discussion, and may I apologise for the opening quotation on my first slide. I purely put it there because I knew that Professor Tom Frame was an avid reader of Joseph Conrad, and having found that particular phrase in one of his books, I thought it only appropriate to put it in front of Tom to say that, let him know that I'd read it. But thank you very much for your presentation, and in fact I will touch on, I've got largely a slideshow, so it's not, the academics can put their notebooks down at this point in time because we're just going to go through a bit of a journey. But you talked about the cantonments, the Fallentil cantonments, and I've got some pictures of that and what extraordinary discipline undertaken by Fallentil at that point in time, I'll tease out. So while I talk a little bit about, I guess, the journey of 50 military liaison officers 20 years ago, and I know that Martin is following me talking about the Federal Police contingent, a much larger contingent than ours, I'd also like to just highlight a couple of other groups. UN officials that lived through the same sort of journey that I'm going to describe, our consulate staff, our very small consulate in East Timor at the time. And I'm also going to mention the journalists because we observed firsthand the courage of journalists, and mainly Australian journalists, who brought to the world, in particular from the announcement of the outcome of the ballot and the weeks that followed, there were many Australian journalists in particular that demonstrated extraordinary courage in bringing that story to the Australian public, and in many ways I think gave the Prime Minister of the day and General Cosgrove that strong wind behind their sails, knowing what the level of support of the Australian public. I caught up with a now retired journalist, Mark Dodd, who was in East Timor with us 20 years ago, and I've always, even as an intelligence official, have a very modulated view of media because of my own experience of watching them firsthand and the extraordinary courage that they display to their craft, and I saw that firsthand in 1999. Let's just see if I get this right. Yeah, just to remind you all how young we were 20 years ago, I show this particular picture because my wife's here, wife of 33 years, who's never heard me talk about East Timor, and this picture is one of those trying to make contact with her in the balcony of Corps M164, which was the TNI headquarters at the time. And the way that the military has evolved over time is quite instructive because they gave us these small satellite phones, which we really appreciated as Dili was under duress. But the very clear instructions from the headquarters at the time to me as the commander was that our people were allowed to talk for social welfaring purposes to our families for 5 minutes per fortnight. That was the allocated amount of time that we could speak to our family. I think the budget was pretty tight at the time. I went back as the commander, indicating that that presented a tremendous dilemma for my contingent, that we were unsure whether we should every fortnight ring our family for 5 minutes or put it into the bank and once a month break out and have a 10-minute conversation. They didn't see the sort of dry humour that I was trying to exude in the somewhat unreasonableness of trying to explain to the headquarters at the time what it was I was trying to say. But I fell back on who the individual will now call the Archangel, because, Your Excellency, you talked about the angels flying in. Clearly now Sir Peter really should be referenced here as the Archangel of the day. Archangel Sir Peter. I channeled his general view of life, always very supportive of junior officers, always a very strong ethical framework, but the twinkle in the eye that always caused you to say, sometimes you just beg forgiveness and do what you need to do. So at this point in time, when things were really getting a little bit ugly, we just went, just go for it. You need to talk to your families. Just before, I'll just quickly cover the mandate that we had with UNAMET. I'll talk a little bit about the build-up. I'll talk about some of the key players that were there, some of our observations, the mess that we lived through, and then some final observations. Just prior to, I better keep an eye on the clock here, just prior to deploying in there, I'd read a book by Gordon Sullivan, who was a former chief of the US Army, who wrote a book, Hope is Not a Method. And I confess, in fact, I took it across to East Timor with me. It's a very, very good book, Hope is Not a Method. And I confess for me and for our contingent, and I speak for the Federal Police, there were a number of days where we knew what we wanted to achieve for the people of East Timor, but it did feel very much like, on some of those days, hope is not a method. This could go terribly, terribly wrong. The mandate, just to sort of clear that up, involved on the 11th of June, or was finally agreed to on the 11th of June, this arrangement to organise and conduct a popular consultation, and then it explained the components that were all part of the UNAMET mission. And you'll see in the civilian component was significantly the larger of the components on the sort of security front, and within the military liaison, quite a small component with these tasks. So, you know, in effect, the Indonesian military, fell until provide this general advice to the Special Representative of the Secretary General on military matters, and a report on the security situation, which really gave us the entree to build relationships with the militia leaders, which we invested quite a lot of time and effort in. UN build-ups are always interesting. That's what an office of the Chief of Operations, me, looked like at the end of week one, and you can see all the hallmarks of a UN operation. And after 2 weeks, it's been improved by a jar of Vegemite. Thanks, Kate, for sending that. And next to the jar of Vegemite, what used to be a mobile phone of those days for the younger in the audience amongst you. You know, one thing about the UN is it moves quickly, and we've touched on this, but as other speakers have said today, there is much you can be. There is much you can say about the UN in the detail that can frustrate you. But when you see vehicles rolling out of an aircraft of this size, funded by the Japanese, so Japanese vehicles that were surplus to demand at the time, literally rolling out at Bacau, and this is within weeks, you can see the extent to which the UN, you know, countries can play their part, whatever their part, whatever is appropriate to their political circumstances. But, you know, that level of logistic support to a small mission like ours, that support from the UN, you know, was extraordinarily important. And of course, the individual currently sitting in the fourth row, John Gould, is there with me and was a key member of our contingent. You shouldn't call out individuals, but you know, it does boil down to the quality of individuals. And for whatever reason, the Australian Army in John had invested in an individual to be a fluent speaker in both Tetun and in Bahasa Indonesia before we deployed. What a strategic asset in the shape of one individual. Many of you will know Ian Martin, who was the special representative. He was over in East Timor only a week or two ago and sent us a very nice email of how touching it was for him to be back in East Timor and to see the development that was there. Ian came from very much a humanitarian background. He very much brought a humanitarian bent towards the mission, a great heart. And clearly he appreciated, if you will, that his understanding of and appreciation of the security situation, if you like, from from a military perspective, military eyes, or from policing eyes, was something that he needed assistance with. And I think he was very good in the way that he brought in a number of us to help inform him and advise him as to what was going ahead of us, or what was ahead of us. And there you'll see Ian Martin with Alan Mills, who was the senior Australian police officer, very steady hand, dealing with a very large Australian police contingent, and I think had a very good line of communication to the Prime Minister as well, in particular in those more difficult days towards the end. And Razakil Haider, who was from Bangladesh and was the senior military officer in the rank of brigadier. This was a good body language day, so without putting too fine a point on it, and now that I'm in an organisation where there are body language experts, you could say that picture tells you quite a few things, and that is a good body language day. We were genuinely wanting to build a rapport. We wanted to work through security issues, and we would often have meetings like this in Quorum 164, and it was true to say that those meetings were difficult, very, very difficult indeed. The interesting thing about Quorum 164 for me, and perhaps another signpost of the way the Australian military has managed its relationships over many, many years, the commander at the time was a fellow by the name of Tono Saratman, who had been the Quorum commander there for quite some time. But as we got closer to the ballot itself, he was moved out of country and he was replaced by a colonel by the name of Mohammed Muis, who I had served with in Staff College all of 1993. So 6 years before, I'd served with the Indonesian commander, Muis, who found himself in this location throughout the most difficult time of East Timor, was taking direct phone calls from General Wiranto. And in the last week, I actually moved into his headquarters to try and broker arrangements between the security situation on the ground, trying to levy off the friendship that I'd built 6 years before. But it says something about the depth and the breadth of individual relationships and friendships that have been brought in over time. There's John Gould again. John, this must be your camera. And of course the Prime Minister of East Timor, Taumata Ruark, who we met. So we visited his cantonment in Waimori, and I'll just quickly show that, because as we flew in, the sort of scene unfolds from the air as you come into a cantonment like this. So the scene unfolds, and as you get closer, you can actually see that, they were very, the integrity of the camp, the discipline in the camp that the ambassador spoke of, the relationship between the women, the children, the security element of the camp there, and those who were just generally there for protection was an extraordinary thing to be part of. It made you realise, when I think about my current job, there is no doubt that Falentil was one of the great human intelligence organisations of the era. I don't know the full story as a human intelligence organisation of the penetrations that it would have had. My working assumption is that penetrations would have been quite significant in through militia, in through the Indonesian military, and maybe one day that story will be told. But it is true that Falentil, one of the great human intelligence organisations of our region and era. Look, the environment, what we observed, of course, really were the raising of these militias really from late December onwards. We got to meet with individuals like João Tavares and Eurico Guterres. You couldn't help but compare and contrast, and of course we were assiduously seeking to remain neutral. Humans being what they are, you couldn't help but compare and contrast the type of individuals that were leading those militias, the style of leadership they used, the way that they persuaded their followers to act with people like Taumata Ruark. The difference was stark. Really, and it touches on this at the second bottom point there, we lived through a number of different incidences. Time precludes going through those incidences, but very early, even in UNAMET's deployment, there was an issue where IDPs were moving from an IDP camp in through Lakeisha in a convoy for which the UN was managing the top and tail of the convoy. The convoy was stopped. Machetes came out. Our people, unarmed, really dealt with some extraordinary circumstances where the fallback can only be judgment and courage at the time as to how best to settle the situation down and how to deal with the situation. And I can honestly say of the military people, virtually every one of us found ourselves at some point in time, and I'll let the police tell their story, but dealing with some situation for which it felt like hope was not going to be the method here, really didn't know how this would play out. And we're obviously very, we can now look back 20 years later and sort of reflect how some of these things played out. But that convoy in Lakeisha and other days, I think we were very much on very tenuous ground. I talk about two chains of command. Of course, what we were really trying to get to help the UN understand, and then Martin understand, was that both with TNI and with the militia, there was a traditional chain of command up through the command network, up through the Quorum, and other superior commands right up to General Oranto. But there were a significant number of retired intelligence officials, retired intelligence generals who were also either in East Timor or elsewhere. And you could tell that there was an intelligence chain of command that was working in parallel to the military chain of command. And we never quite got to the bottom of that, and we weren't privy to all of the intelligence that was available. But I think it is interesting to compare and contrast the sort of manner in which a country like Australia manages intelligence operations. We would never find ourselves in a situation where individuals are trying to answer concurrently to two different chains of command. And in the case of East Timor in 1999, that's what we saw. It is true that because we were active in trying to understand the security situation, we were talking to militia leaders, we were talking to Falintil leaders. That meant that there was a great deal of suspicion about our motives and what we were doing, and we felt very exposed as we tried to, what I say there is fight for information. So as we got closer to the ballot, there were a considerable number of death threats that were passed our way. But by way of contrast, as I've said before, the discipline, the high moral ground was very uplifting actually to the military observers that were part of UNAMET. The language of dry the tears of the widows and orphans was a phrase that I heard Taumatan Ruak use in Waimori in a speech that he gave. But the moral and ethical high ground that he was assuming, the discipline that the ambassador talked about, is something that will live with us for the rest of our lives. Zaki Anwar was one of those intelligence generals that was in Dili at the time, and he made it very clear face-to-face that Australian military liaison officers in particular should stop being as aggressive in their dealings with the pro-integrationists. So there was lots of warnings that were coming our way. We were genuinely trying to calibrate our disposition, the work that we were doing, not to make it any worse. It was bad enough as it was. But therein lay a real challenge for us. And of course, Polri had been given primacy of the security situation, which was a tremendous problem in its own right. Polri had always operated under the shadow of TNI, and the separation that was only made months before we actually deployed into East Timor. And it was very clear to Polri themselves that while in theory they were running security in East Timor at the time, they were very much subordinate to TNI. Really, I say here the script plays out that once the ballot results were given, over 6 days and 13 regions between the 3rd and the 9th of September, the evacuation and the bringing of the ballot boxes, I say the script plays out. The script basically went like this. in each of those locations, in each of those regions, we would normally find our people under attack. Live rounds would be going into the UN compound in whatever town or location they were. UN would then be contacted. We would then receive this message that the safety of our people could no longer be guaranteed. That would then lead to emergency planning. We were literally working day and night as we managed with very few resources to safely evacuate almost everyone from all of those locations without harm, following that warning that their safety couldn't be guaranteed. And so then we would start the deployment back. But it felt like a script because we lived through this story 13 times as we tried to manage the evacuation of the 13 locations. And then, you know, from my perch in front of Quorum 164, leading with Mohammed Mouis, having many discussions with him about what was going on in the ground because we lost our eyes and ears once the evacuation folded into either Dili or Baucau. I really became the conduit to try and understand what was going on and trying to, if you like, lever off that relationship with Mouis to try and moderate some of the behaviour. And so, you know, it really sort of lost control, and many of you may have seen some of the images, but this takes a lot of effort to undertake this level of damage. This is not something that happens easily. So there'll be some memories for a number of you here. My room in the Turismo Hotel was burnt and ransacked. And so there's a very young me. And I still have my room key, room number 20 from the Turismo Hotel. Your Excellency, I never paid the bill. So when you're back there next week, or the Archangel Sir Peter, if you wouldn't mind, I'd really appreciate it. Okay, I better finish up. Look, there were all sorts of messages that we saw once we were able to get back out on the streets again. This one from Abel Guterres, which loosely translates, I understand, to this: I came carrying the fire of death and I drink the blood of anti-integrationists. Before you enjoy the results of the United Nations and Australia's deceit, I will totally destroy you. Did you think you could have freedom with sacrifice? That was his calling card as we were cleaning up. Final observations. Look, use of proxy forces. When the nation state falls back on proxy forces, you cross a very dangerous line. So that's the first lesson I would say, or observation I would make. The second I would make is, and I think the Ambassador's made it better than me, but the galvanising power of quiet determination, and Sir Peter said this. You know, the locals are extraordinary, and they remain in our heart, of course, forevermore. And the third observation I would make is, you know, leadership without fanfare. And I think the Prime Minister led that under extraordinary global attention. But it really was leadership without fanfare. And I think Australia deliberately sought to try and put itself in the back seat, highlight the courage of the local people, but do it without fanfare. And I think in General Sir Peter, through military leadership, that technique worked so well, and something to which we're all very thankful for. So I guess my final comment is, yep, hope is not a method. Sure, I get that. But with conviction, courage and good people, it is remarkable what you can achieve. So that's a little UNAMET story. Thank you.
Paul, I will long remember when you say the script played out. When you arrived, did you suspect that the script would play out? And if not when you arrived, how close to the time of the vote were you convinced it was going to play out?
I mean, when I first arrived, a quick story of when I first arrived. So I was commanding a unit in Brisbane at the time, and literally the week before the mandate came through, I'd had a pretty busy time. The previous Christmas, we'd arranged, because of a big influx of recruits, to run a recruit course up in Brisbane, and I was put in charge of that by General Cosgrove and Frank Roberts, who was the brigade commander. So I'd worked through Christmas for that. We'd had our 50th anniversary as a unit literally the week before. General Cosgrove rang me on a Monday at 11 o'clock. So he rings me as a unit commander and says, Paul, interesting developments in East Timor. You're flying to Canberra tomorrow, which was a Tuesday, to get intelligence briefings. You're flying to Sydney on Wednesday to go to Headquarters Australian Theatre for briefings. On Thursday, go to your unit and say goodbye to your unit. And on Friday, you're on a plane to New York because you're writing a concept of operations for the military contingent. Are there any questions? That's when your mind is going, are there any questions? But having worked for General Cosgrove, what the mouth says, no sir, that is perfectly clear. Which is the way I answered the question. But coming back to your question, Tom, it meant though that I did go to Canberra. I went to the Defence Intelligence Organisation. I went to the theatre. The intelligence information that I was privy to before I went, which of course I became disconnected from for quite a while, but it was very good. It was high quality intelligence, and I had a pretty good understanding of how this might play out. That's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make is your point about how the script would play out close to the time. I think that a number of us inside the military component, the more senior people, had pretty well worked out how the script was going to work out. I think the hard part for us is how the sequencing and how the limited resources to deal with the number of the ballot boxes and the number of people that we needed to get back, how best to sequence and organise that, it could not be predicted. We had to be flexible in all of that, but I think the general script we'd already worked out.
And when did you think you were not going to succeed in stopping what happened? Or were you were never equipped to do that, so therefore INTERFET was inevitable or unavoidable?
I mean, I think that the UN in many ways, so the UN compound itself, once we'd all come back to the same location, obviously we'd let a lot of people in, and we were dealing with a quite serious health and safety problem in the compound, as some of you might remember. And it became, in the discussions with Ian Martin, I think, apparent that an evacuation of the UN actually was important in its own right, because it was going to provide a vehicle by which the arrival of INTERFET and an intervention force would be made possible. So I think that there are a number of different ways this could have played out, but I think very much the sentiment, given the situation that we'd found ourselves in over a number of weeks and the way that we were living in the compound and the tenuous nature of that arrangement, was such that a number of us were giving advice which really went against our instincts and was difficult to recommend, but it was a strong recommendation that we do withdraw, that it would be wise to withdraw for a range of reasons, but it also would, for the world, provide the conditions that made an intervention that much more sort of palpably obvious that it needed to occur. And I'm not suggesting that we were the reason that the intervention occurred. I'm just saying that it was one of those milestones that I think was important in the way it all played out.
Thank you. Mr. Howard.
General, were you in any doubt, or were you in any way surprised, or rephrase it, at the scale of the vote for complete separation?
No, I was not. We knew the ground, we'd spoken to the people, we knew where the vote was going to go, very, very clearly.
Better than news polls.
Indeed.
Other questions?
Paul, I hesitate to do this with Kate in the audience, but you and I have discussed this before. You alluded to the conditions of danger which you and your team lived with throughout that. And of course you were there in a UN team. I wonder if you could make some observations about what you think some of the considerations that arose from that experience were, not only for soldiers who take this as a part of their contract, but also for the civilians and the police that found themselves in that circumstance, and what recommendations you might make for future operations.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Look, I think the military has picked this up, but you talk about other components, and I won't speak for them, but I would say this, and that is the aftercare, the conversations are really, really important, and it goes on even 20 years later. John and I continue to have conversations with an individual or two who are really struggling. Why? Don't know. It may be issues that predate actually 1990. It may be part of an upbringing. I mean, I'm no expert. What I do know is constant conversations and touching in with people following these types of activities are really, really important as an ongoing conversation. People heavily look to their commanders, their immediate bosses to initiate those conversations and to care. And I would say, as a general rule, certainly inside the Australian military, that empathy, that style of leadership, of talking to your people, caring about your people, is universally important. It doesn't matter whether you're part of the police or DFAT or any. All need to sort of use that formula as the basis to try and deal with individuals' reactions to this type of environment.
Please join with me in thanking General Simon this morning.